it in public forum.
Back in 1910, they called themselves the Jekyll Island Club. Collectively, members represented more than 1/6 the wealth of the entire world. So anxious were they to keep any knowledge of their meetings secure, they used code names even when talking to friends. "We're going to Jamaica," they would say, and those in the know would understand they were traveling to Jekyll Island.
The immediate excuse was the money panic of 1907, which was engineered by Jacob Schiff and the Rockefellers to gain control of some corporations they were after. And so then they said, look, we've got another nationwide panic, we've got to have banking reform.
The birth of the Federal Reserve System, we know, was at Jekyll Island, Georgia, in a secret meeting that took place that was attended by Senator Aldrich, who was the chairman of the banking committee, and whose son I knew, incidentally, Winthrop Aldrich, when he was chairman of the Chase Bank.
The Aldrich Bill, as it was initially called, received such violent opposition from Democrats and reformers like William Jennings Bryan that despite avid lobbying by the monopoly men, the bill quickly went down to defeat.
Once the Aldrich Bill flopped, the bankers immediately moved to Plan B. It didn't work from trying to push it through with Republicans, so they tried to push it through with Democrats.
We had, in 1912, a very popular president, a Republican named William Howard Taft. The bankers needed Woodrow Wilson to sign this act into law. He did not have much charisma. He had not a chance against William Howard Taft.
Teddy Roosevelt. He was an explosion upon the political scene. Dynamic, outspoken, warm, colorful, exciting, inspiring. And under the surface was a man of ideals.
You could say that J.P. Morgan really owned Theodore Roosevelt. You see, his right-hand man, vice president of his bank in New York, George Perkins, lived at the White House. He was the liaison man with the president. And so they drug Theodore Roosevelt out of obscure retirement. Roosevelt formed the Bull Moose Party and split the Republican Party and elected Woodrow Wilson. That's the only way they could do it.
Woodrow Wilson, immediately after his inauguration, called a special session of the Congress to do away with the protective tariff, which had been the thing that had built this country. The second thing that happened was that the income tax came in. And the final thing was the creation of the Federal Reserve, which took place in December, around the Christmas holidays in 1913, that put the cap on this whole revolution.
Most of the senators had gone home for the Christmas holidays. We call that in legislative circles having the skids greased. And the skids were greased and they just slid it right on through. Without much fanfare, the president signed it. It became law of the land.
One of the major opponents during the Federal Reserve Act battle was Representative Charles Lindbergh from Minnesota, who, interestingly enough, was the father of aviator Lucky Lindbergh, the first guy to cross the Atlantic Ocean solo. And Lindbergh fought them tooth and nail and referred to the Federal Reserve Act as the worst legislative crime ever perpetrated in the history of the United States. And that may indeed well be true.
By 1916, even President Wilson was worried. He lamented, "The growth of the nation and all our activities are in the hands of a few men." Near the end of his life, Wilson said that he had been deceived into signing the Fed into law, reportedly murmuring just before he died, "I have unwittingly ruined my government."
In law, when any people meet together to plot to rob somebody, that becomes a criminal operation. It can never be anything else. Throughout its subsequent history, it can never overcome that initial criminal beginning. And that's where we are today, a criminal syndicate. That's all it is. It's all it ever has been.
Did the creation of the Federal Reserve represent a takeover of the United States by shadowy international financiers? Certainly, the Fed was designed to serve somebody's interest, but whose?
Not the American banking community. It was the international banking community. The Morgans were an international family. The fortune had first been made in England, but they were allied with the Rothschilds and others in England, and one of their agents drafted the script for the Federal Reserve.
The Rothschild family is one of the wealthiest families the world has ever known. By the early 1800s, they established themselves as the most important bankers in all Europe. By the end of the 19th century, they are said to control half the wealth of the world. As Rothschild biographer Derek Wilson explains, Rothschild critics have justification for their anxiety. The House of Rothschild is immensely more powerful than any financial empire that has ever preceded it, and it's able to control governments behind the scenes, secretly.
Economic power, political power go hand in hand, and it's like Mayor Rothschild of the Rothschild banking family in Germany said, "Give me control of a nation's monetary system, and I care not who writes their laws."
Nathan Rothschild in 1820 might have had more right to say that than any of his successors. The statement is more or less absurd. The Federal Reserve does not control the money supply. The Federal Reserve influences the money supply.
To say that the Federal Reserve only influences the money supply is like saying a robber with a gun to your head is only influencing you to give him his money. And of course, if you give him your money, you may be spared your life, but here again, you don't have your money anymore.
There has been, in the last 30 or 40 years, a much greater international flavor to the activities of the Fed because the banking system has become global. And you could no longer regulate the U.S. money supply by simply via the domestic Federal Reserve banks.
The Federal Reserve controls the very heart of what's happening with money because money answers everything. It's the one thing that everybody wants. And when you give a private institution a monopoly on the creation of this money, you vest total control in that institution.
If you have the money, you can get any law passed you want. So who do you care whether Bill Clinton is president or who is senator from New Jersey? It doesn't make any difference because you write a check and you get another senator.
One of the stickiest questions in this debate is this: just who owns the Federal Reserve?
The City of London set the whole thing up. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is principally owned by 5 merchant banks in London, chartered by the Bank of England.
Perhaps England, which many have considered a political satellite of the United States in recent years, is really the one pulling the strings of international policy.
It's not a matter of who owns the Fed, it's who controls it. The government has given the banks a monopoly, and then you see the Justice Department doing nothing about the bank mergers. A monopoly can only exist with government assistance, and they've given great assistance to the banking monopoly.
Perhaps the headiest allegation made against those who run the Federal Reserve is that they are responsible for 3 of the biggest tragedies of the 20th century: World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression.
Wars are very profitable. In fact, wars are probably the most profitable thing an international banker can be involved in. So consequently, throughout the last at least 300 years of North American and European history, you see incidents of international bankers backing both sides of a conflict.
They'd been trying to have a war in Europe since 1885, but the central banks of Europe had already bankrupted all the nations of Europe. They had no money. The only money was here in the United States. In order to get that money, they had to put a central bank over on the American people.
It was sold as a way to bring stability to the American economy. Well, what happens just a little over a decade after the passage of the Fed? We see the biggest depression of this century in any case.
For the 16 months prior to the crash of '29, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply by 62%. Now, what was happening back then? Much like it's happening today. People were buying and selling, pledging and borrowing, thinking the good times would never end. And then at the time of the crash, they pulled the plug on the money supply, and the people who had pledged their stocks, their bonds, their homes, their cars, everything, they pledged their savings accounts, they lost it all.
Selling guns to one adversary while making loans to another is a common way these boys make their profits during war. And when profits begin sagging, people like Jacob Schiff, Max Warburg, and J.P. Morgan knew how to build them up again. Surprise, surprise, it's a documented fact that these fellows financed Trotsky and Lenin with billions in gold and credit to initiate the revolution in Russia. With Russia out of the war and America in, the conflict was extended by at least another 2 years. 2 more